So the aim of the event is really partly to tell people about the issue that we're discussing, but it's also going to be a call to action. So for those of you that are listening to the talk and are really invested in the discussions that want to do more, we will be sending out a link to a Google form at the end of the event for you to sign up or to share how you are interested in taking part in any further action in the future. So please do look out for that a little bit later on in the event, and we really do hope that you will be interested in continuing this conversation and taking this action further. We have also produced a guide to the issue, which largely summarises what we'll be talking about today, and we'll send a copy of the recording to you after the event along with that guide and along with a link to sign up so that you can follow up with any specific campaign orientated events, which will probably be happening in July. Okay, so I think that's it for some of the formalities. There's still a few people that will be joining us, of course, as we're going over the next few minutes. So don't worry about anyone else that's joining the room over the next wee while. But I am going to hand over to Claire just now, who's going to give the introduction to the event. Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. As always, a great introduction. I'm Claire. I'm the founder and chair of Planning Democracy. Most of you know that we are a grassroots, largely voluntary campaign organisation campaigning for a better planning system in Scotland. And a lot of you will also know that we campaigned very hard on your behalf during the planning reforms that led to the 2019 Planning Scotland Act. During that time, we campaigned hard for an equal right of appeal so that we could level the playing field between developers being able to have the right of appeal and giving communities a right to appeal planning decisions. We were unsuccessful, but during that time, the 4 years that we were working to change the planning system in Scotland, we became aware of the huge influence of the developer lobby. And to illustrate this, Ben McPherson, who's an MSP for Edinburgh, recently said at a hustings just before the elections, he said quite matter-of-factly that the reason the communities weren't given the right to appeal planning decisions was because the housing lobby objected. We also hear from a lot of communities throughout Scotland who are struggling to fight multiple applications on large scale housing developments, most of which are speculative. And through that, we have become aware of the way that developers manipulate housing figures and housing land supply figures and use them to challenge planning decisions and to affect the local development plan. And they use a lot of sort of poorly or weakly written policies to push forward their speculative applications. And this problem reached a peak last June following a landmark court case by Gladmans, who are a land promoter who buy up vast swathes of land and apply for planning permission in order to make money out of the increase in the land value that you get from gaining planning permission. And Gladmans are a sort of renowned serial litigator. So they took this court case and they won, which meant that the house builders could even more easily gain planning permission for housing using this legal precedent to their advantage. And the Scottish government recognised that this was a problem, and they brought out a consultation on a new policy to strengthen the policy. And they had already attempted to try and do something about this in 2014. But again, due to pressure from the housing lobby, they withdrew their consultation. This time round, they actually changed the planning policy to try and prevent these inappropriate speculative developments from being pushed through. And we've been watching what's been happening since that new policy was brought out, this interim policy in December. And there's been one appeal that has happened where the decision went against the developer. So it's possible that this new policy is working in strengthening the sort of policy framework to create a better sense of what they want in terms of sustainable development. However, once again, another developer, McTaggart and Mickle, have decided to challenge the Scottish Government on this policy and have now taken that to court as well. So we are awaiting that court case result even as we speak. So we recognise that there's a really big problem here. It's clear that there's a housing crisis. House prices are pretty extortionate and many people struggle to pay rent or afford a mortgage. And there's a clear gap between those who have houses and who've benefited from the increase in their value, but there's also a generation of young people who are unable to afford rent or a mortgage. Meanwhile, we have huge numbers of planning permissions being applied for on greenfield sites where there's no transport links and where the developments are hugely unappealing and of poor quality. So we've been exploring these issues at Planning Democracy and been looking at the work of others to try to help us to understand the full extent of the problem. You know, it's a complex issue, and we're still sort of getting our heads around it, really. And this is where Bob comes in. And I'd like to thank Bob for agreeing to come to speak to us tonight, and for also, responding to my, questions and being very generous with his time. Because Bob has written this very informative book, and I really do recommend that you get it because it's really easy to read. In this book, Bob talks about the housing developer lobby that you describe as the finance house building complex. Maybe you want to talk about that in your talk, Bob, but you focus mostly on England in your book, Bob, but the problems are essentially the same, and we were talking earlier about how we might sort of discuss the slight differences between England and Scotland, but essentially the issue is the same. So in his book Bob makes passionate arguments and gives compelling evidence that really go to the heart of the problem, and importantly they help us to consider the ways that we can go about changing things. So Bob describes himself as a community activist and a commentator on housing and planning. And he's also a lecturer at Oxford Brookes University on housing and planning issues as well. So I'd like to thank Bob for coming and welcome him. And if you'd like to speak, that would be awesome. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Claire, for that introduction. I've looked at some of the materials that Planning Democracy, your organisation, has produced, which are, very good statement of what's going on. And so I just hope I'll be able to add something to that, because obviously you're very well informed. And maybe we can just get into a discussion about, how we can engage in the politics of this, which are really kind of a very huge challenge to us. This is just an outline of really what I want to say. I'm hoping to talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and talk a little bit about what is this housing crisis? What are we talking about? What is the property lobby? Let's talk a little bit about the house builders business model, and then spend the last part of the talk talking about an entirely new approach to these issues. So just starting off with kind of what is this crisis? Now, it strikes me, and probably many of you as well, that there are really two entirely different crises going on. Theirs, that is the property developers, landowners, and finance people. Their crisis is one of land supply. They just see the problem is there isn't enough land available in their land banks or land available to develop. So that's their housing crisis. Our housing crisis is completely different. Ours is a crisis about affordability, about quality, it's about placemaking, but fundamentally it's a democracy crisis. And so these two sides, and they are two sides, are coming at it from entirely different directions. So they see shortages of land for building. They're scouring the country, the nation, for land for building. Whereas we see housing waiting lists and land speculation. So again, we're seeing a completely different nation, really. They just see, you know, sites, and we see waiting lists, and we see greed and land speculation. It's completely different perspective on these things. And where does government stand? Well, government is actually really working with very, very closely with the house builders. They set housing targets, which are largely housing targets to satisfy the house builders that they mean business in meeting their requirements. They shower them with subsidies, enormous subsidies, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And of course, they promote home ownership rather than other tenures, which are really essential to meet housing need. All of that is just good news to the house builders and their supporters. Housing targets, subsidies, and constant talk of home ownership. That's what it's all about for them. And as a result of all that, we have a weakened, demoralized local planning system, which is really incapable of delivering for local communities. But none of this is new. This has been going on for decades. There's been countless reports written by think tanks, by academics, by government itself, talking about, you know, how there's such serious need for housing and affordable housing, and something must be done about it, and so on and so forth. It's been going on for decades, but nothing really serious has happened. So the question is, why is this? Why, despite all these authoritative reports, House of Commons committees and so on, over 30, 40 years, nothing has improved. In fact, things have got worse. Well, my argument is that, I mean, I'm slightly oversimplifying this, but there has developed a finance house building complex where big finance and the big house builders are now, which were sort of very scattered set of organizations 30, 40 years ago, now fully aligned with government, perpetuating and sometimes manufacturing the housing crisis to suit their interests. I mean, by manufacturing a housing crisis, I mean that, you know, when there's anywhere near a whisper of a slump in the housing market, the government says we need to provide more subsidies, more land, more relaxation of planning controls, and so on, primarily to suit the interests of their finance house building complex. So what's happened is that landowners, finance interests and investors, developers, and government have become interdependent. They depend upon each other. They support each other politically and financially. And we have, as a result, become a property-dependent economy and a property-dependent political system. The consequence of that is that investors and government ensure that values go ever upwards, whilst we want the opposite. In other words, the foundation of this finance house building complex and this interdependency is that values must go up. Otherwise, there's no point in investing in land and property. For them, land values, I'm talking about land values and property values and investment values, have got to go up. Whereas we, who are seeking to meet needs in housing, want precisely the opposite. We want lower values, stable house prices, lower rents. So these two things are completely in opposition to each other. They're structurally in opposition to each other. So what is the property lobby? And, you know, they are a list of organizations that many of you know, who are very well organized, very well funded, have the ear of government, all the governments in the United Kingdom. Their primary purpose, you could say, is political lobbying, although they do a lot of technical and support work locally as well. And who are the main players? There are quite a lot of players, but these are the main players: the Home Builders Federation, the Country Landowners Association, the British Property Federation, which is mainly concerned with commercial property, the Land Promoters and Developers Association, which is mainly concerned with finding land on behalf of developer clients and getting them through the planning process so they can, developers can act upon them. UK Finance, that used to be called the British Banking Association, and they now themselves are very closely integrated with the mortgage associations, a very important part of British finance. And then last but not least, we've got the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, the RICS, which is the accreditation body for surveyors and valuers. They have the ear of government. Government goes to them for advice on a whole range of things. And they ensure that the fees that consultants, chartered surveyors receive are related to the values that they deal with. So they've got a built-in interest in values going upwards. Now, their clients being, developers and landowners and financial interests. My estimation is that they capture 90% of the value created by planning. I mean, we all know that by granting planning permission, the value of land goes up, rockets up by 100 or even 200 times above its greenfield value. Where does that land value go? It goes to the clients representing these property lobby organizations. And where is that value created geographically? I don't have an exact figure for that, but most of that value is in London and the Southeast. That's where the greatest increase in value is. That's where the greatest land value capture is. That's the heart, the beating heart of the UK property system is in a relatively small part of the United Kingdom, in London and the Southeast. Of course, they operate elsewhere, but the most important part of their business is in London and the Southeast. And these bodies have exceptional access to government and to the HM Treasury, which in turn relies upon them. If government or HM Treasury is even thinking about taxation issues relating to property, they will go and talk to the various organizations representing investors in the property lobby. So it's kind of a two-way, it's a constant two-way relationship, this exceptional access. It's not access that is kind of like just about golf clubs. This is a normal exchange between civil servants in central government and these organizations. And it's a normal exchange between offices in local government and the local manifestations of these organizations. For example, the Home Builders Federation deals with lots of local councils, as does the British Property Federation, and so on. So we have a kind of an administrative system which is incredibly well integrated with the property lobby. And obviously, as you're aware of this, there's an increasing concentration of ownership of land and property and value and control within the house building and land markets. And so this is just some figures I just picked out from the house building market. This is a UK house building market. The top 3 UK house builders are Barratt, Taylor Woodrow and Persimmon. In 2019, their accumulated profits were 2.7 billion. They've got 750,000 housing plots under their control. And they build between them 50,000 units per annum, which is a total of the total private supply. So this is the extent of the monopolization and concentration. And if you mapped those locally, within Scotland, within Wales, within the area I live in London and the Southeast, these organizations would be evident there with that kind of level of control of supply. that could constitute, and I think does constitute in some cases, a cartel. Now, exactly what is going on a day-to-day basis? The property lobby, the house builders rather, has a very well-honed and well thought out business model, which it's been written up by academics, it's written up by their own technical people. And this model is protected and enhanced by government. The key ingredient of this model is land. The most important thing for the house builders is to get hold of land and then hopefully get planning permission on that land. But even if they don't get planning permission initially, the important thing is to get control of land as much as possible, years ahead, 20 years ahead. And thus, there is government support for land banking. There must be. Without land banking, you don't get a successful house building business. And the second ingredient of this business model is to maximize the land value captured. There's no point in holding land unless you can capture the land value created by the change of that land from its existing use to housing. And the important thing for the market is to capture most of that land value. Obviously, it's shared between the landowner and the developer, and they in turn have to share it with, the surveyors and the architects and pay fees to various people. But the important thing about the house builders is that they need to capture to maximize the land value captured, because that's their profit effectively. The third job that the government does for them is to protect landowner profits. Landowner profits are very weakly taxed. They're often hidden, as we know from, the work that's been done by, by a number of people have written about landowner profits and how they're hidden. And then there's this extraordinary industry standard that the developers will expect to take 20% profit. It's like a markup on any scheme. It's like a guaranteed profit on any development. That's a kind of minimum they'd expect to have. So all of these things are kind of constantly protected. If you go to planning inquiries, valuation tribunals, it's always the same, 20% developer industry standard profit. Nobody really questions it. And the fourth element of the model is to capture the planning system. That's crucial because that converts land into planning consents. And they have been incredibly successful in capturing the planning system. So the planning system is tilted towards value creation. That's the creation of this value that I've been talking about, rather than land use or the environment. It's not the purpose of capturing the planning system to deal with land use or the environment, but its purpose is to create value for investors and for house developers and for landowners. So that's the extent in which the planning system has been utterly distorted from its kind of legal purpose set out in the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, that it should be about land use or about the environment, or even, God help us, about society. No, the planning system has been tilted towards value creation. And the fifth element of the model is to maximize public subsidy. The property lobby has been astonishingly successful in persuading all governments, all parts of the United Kingdom, to subsidize the house builders through, in England, the Help to Buy scheme, the government's homes agencies with grants and loans. And all of that in 2017 amounted to 40 billion. I mean, this is an extraordinary amount of money that's going to basically subsidize a business model. Now, compare that with, in 1975, social housing subsidy from governments was 18 billion. In 2014, social housing subsidy had fallen to 1.2 billion. So we've got the complete opposite. We've got an increase in subsidy to the house builders, a massive reduction in subsidy to social and special needs housing, which of course is completely scandalous and immoral, but that's what's happened. So then, you know, we conclude there that the lobby, the property lobby, as I call it, has rigged the market very, very successfully in land, housing and planning, and has captured government. And for government, the property market is now indispensable. It's an indispensable part of economic management. And it's an indispensable part of the way in which the economy is managed on a day-to-day basis. But, and this is the sort of hopeful bit, but we are not powerless. And this is where we get to the possibility that we can do something about it. Now, what we need is something entirely different from the way in which we've been thinking about land and property and planning. We need an ideological shift. A lot of people, including ourselves perhaps, have been captured by the sort of ideology that we have to depend upon the house building market to give us what we need in terms of affordable housing. Hence various attempts to capture planning gain from private developers. And that has now become a sort of primary policy of successive governments, is to try to extract some benefits from the private house building market to plow into social and affordable housing. Now that has not worked. It has not worked, it has not produced enough social affordable housing. The developers have still got away with 90% of the value created. It's plainly reached the buffers in terms of what it can achieve. So we need a new parallel public housing development system with community land purchase and building at scale. I say community land purchase. Andy Whiteman said, you know, if you say state ownership of land or something, you know, people think there's going to be some massive state land grab. So that's why I use the phrase community land purchase and building at scale. So that's essential. We must kind of, that's the mindset, away from thinking that the private house building markets can somehow do it for us if we talk to them nicely, or if we kind of introduce various mechanisms to kind of shave off a little bit of that value into the public and community sector. We can't do it. A limit's been reached. No more can be achieved. And the second element of this ideological shift is land reform. Now that phrase is literally never used in England. It is a phrase that's used in Scotland very successfully in many ways. But this involves various elements, right? First of all, it's capturing land value for the community by taxation to ensure that, let's say, even half of that 90% of value was captured by the community by taxation. Or let's say even 25% was. I mean, that would make a massive difference, the amount of money that's available for public services, including housing. But the second part of it is, and this is really where you can capture land value, is you take land out of the speculative market by compulsory purchase or by various moves by local and central government to take land out of the market so that it can be developed on a use value basis as opposed to a market value basis. Only if you take land out of the speculative market is that possible. And then the third element of this ideological shift is to break up the house builders cartel. You know, we already talked about the 3 big house builders, where you can talk about the top 6 house builders or the top 10 who operate pretty much as a cartel on a regional basis and sometimes on a national basis. They must be broken up. They control far too much of the market, and smaller house builders, moderate sized house builders, community house builders simply can't get in because they can't buy the land. The land has already been snapped up by the big house builders. And there's virtually nothing left for anybody else. I mean, around the area I live in, Oxfordshire, and all the shire counties around London, almost all the land has been bought up by house builders years in advance. And so it's impossible to get in on the act because they've got it all. So there needs to be a breakup of the cartel and a redistribution of some of the assets that they own. And the fourth element of this shift is to redirect public subsidies to the public and community sector. So instead of that vast amount of subsidies going to them, let's say at least 25, 50% should go to the public community sector. And then finally, we need to create a new proactive democratic planning system with an emphasis on the word democratic. And that's the sort of big ideological picture, but locally, a lot more. Local government has got to get political. Local government has been stopped from being political over planning. Various measures have been introduced to say that local government mustn't be political when it comes to making planning decisions. That's all nonsense. The Tories don't bother about that, and neither should we. We've got to get political and have the courage to fight back with new interventionist strategies. By intervention, I mean taking land out of the speculative market, introducing local land value taxation if that's possible. And also, this is really crucial. I've been in local government for many years, working in local government, and it's terrified of confrontation. Local government must not be afraid of confrontation. It must take on developers and landowners and government. They must use legal challenges. And instead of public-private partnerships, we need public-civic partnerships so that local authorities are actually working with civic organizations. And then the next part of it is buy land, don't sell it. Because once you've sold land, you're in big trouble. Government's obviously trying to force local authorities, public agencies to sell land. It's really important to stand up and say, no, we're not going to sell any land. And use the law and use whatever we can to say, no, we're not going to sell it. We're going to buy it, buy more. And local government must also get behind community-led housing, seriously. They must get fully behind community land trusts, get behind co-housing, get behind people's plans. Because the task is always this, to prove locally, nationally, to councillors, to other people in the community, to ourselves even, that there is an alternative, that land can be developed in another way. It is not necessary to follow the house builders model. And in fact, when you don't, something miraculous happens. You can actually create something wonderful and can meet needs at the same time. So my final slide is this, and it's about, is it possible to create a new coalition? There's a lot of people very unhappy with the way planning is conducted. There's a lot of people, generationally anyway, who are very unhappy about housing prices and affordability. Is it possible to build a new coalition for housing and planning democracy? I kind of like the phrase housing and planning democracy, because there's a lot in there that I think could draw a lot of people into it. And this coalition would be fighting over and promoting the links between climate action and housing, health and housing rights, and then, this is very topical at the moment, campaigns for real levelling up, not this phony levelling up that, anyway, the Johnson government is promoting. So there's a possibility for a new kind of national coalitions, I think, over housing and planning democracy, because there's a widespread view that planning democracies has been lost. And then combined with demands for housing democracy, there needs to be planning democracy, an end to disempowerment, a call for the breakup of the cartels, demand full transparency to tackle corruption. There's quite a rapid increase in the amount of corruption over planning deals and land markets. And we need to demand full transparency. On behalf of the people of the country, we should be demanding an end to corruption over planning deals and land markets. So this is my final plea, I guess, is we have to start all this soon before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. To take such a complex issue and to it into a few slides takes some skill, and to make that understandable as well. And so thank you for that. I see that we have a few questions already coming into the chat box. So I'm going to hand over now to Andy Inch, who's a long-term supporter and advisor to planning democracy. and he's going to facilitate the question and answer session. So please do put your questions in the chat, and yeah, ask away. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Bob, for a great talk. There have been a few questions coming. I've been monitoring the chat. It's my job for this evening, and we've got about 10 minutes, I think, for further questions. So do keep them coming in the chat. I'm going to try and kind of bring some of what's gone into the chat together. So there's a couple of points that I would put to you, Bob. The first one is one that I think you'll enjoy, which is something that both William and Frankie raised, which is around the sort of whiff of kleptocracy, perhaps a whiff of corruption, and of kind of lobbying power and funding of political parties by the property lobby, and kind of what can be done about that, and how prevalent it is, I suppose.
Well, somebody has said, I don't know, that 50% of the funding of the Conservative Party general election campaign in 2017 and 19 was funded from property interests of one kind or another. That doesn't surprise me. I think it's probably roughly true, and nobody actually knows the real answer to that. And why don't we know the answer to that, you could say. But yeah, I mean, the links between the property industry and the Conservative Party in particular is historically, you know, a very, very close link, particularly with landowners, but increasingly through finance and developers as well. You know, what can be done about it? I mean, we just need to demand, you know, full exposure of these things. And the sort of work that the Good Law Project has done has been exposing that the corruption in the handing out of PP contracts and so on is the kind of thing we need to do a lot more of, is to challenge these things legally. But you know, this is not going to be easy because they're so well integrated, and there's a revolving door between, you know, government and the development industry at local level and national level, which makes this very, very difficult. So I don't have any magic answers on that, but I think it's got to be a key part of the national campaign.
Thanks, Bob. It's a very, very polite answer compared to the one that Frankie's just popped in the chat. I see at the bottom there.
Yeah, go on. What did Frankie say?
Frankie suggests the guillotine for the Tories. I think there's something about the extent to which people are accepting of that kind of influence and that kind of whiff of corruption at the moment, which is really disturbing. So the next question that was coming through was two linked questions really about how this is done, this stuff works in other contexts, and particularly maybe continental European contexts. Is there the same sense of a property lobby at work in those contexts? Was William's question, and Jean was interested in whether there was evidence of the kind of alternatives and ideological alternatives you talk about being evident in any of those contexts.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and you know there really is. I mean, the difference between the way this is the way this works in the Netherlands or Sweden or Germany, it just couldn't be greater. I mean, first of all, there isn't this adversarial relationship between landowners and developers and communities in the same way that we have here, which is this incredible adversarial class-based politics around it. But I mean, they take a much more pragmatic approach. I mean, the best example of this is in the Netherlands, where if there's housing development land, that's first of all bought by the local authorities, who then prepare the land, and then on license say to the house builders, we'll build on that land. You can build on this land, subject to certain specifications and so on. So there is no land speculation in the Netherlands model. It just completely removes land speculation because the local authorities buy the land and prepare it. And if you like, they've captured all the land value. So all the land value is immediately captured by the municipality. You know, I mean, why not? It makes good sense. And there are similar kinds of arrangements in other countries as well, where in Sweden, where they where land is assembled by the public sector, and then house builders who are not speculating in land, they're not speculators, they actually build housing. And you can tell, I mean, you can see a housing estate, I mean, I'm generalizing a bit, in Germany and the Netherlands, it actually does look better than the stuff put up by the top three, you know, Persimmon, Taylor, Woodrow and Barrett. So if you can take the land element out, you get better quality.
Thanks, Bob. That's great. And I think also a lot of times less expectation of profit margin on each development as well for developers in lots of continental Europe, because of that certainty of the land being taken out of the equation. The Scottish Land Commission did a couple of good reports on that if people are interested, and maybe we can link to people to, or point people towards that stuff, can't we, Claire? There was another question from Jean, which was around kind of legal implications for local authorities, and I suppose fear of legal challenges as well, and the way that the legal system works to maintain the property privileges. I'm reminded of the title of Andy Whiteman's book, The Poor Had No Lawyers, but I wonder if you can maybe speak a little bit to the question of how to tackle those legal challenges, Bob.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's something that really particularly interests me, is the way in which time and again local authorities don't challenge things when they could be challenging them. You know, I think that I always feel that part of the answer is not to use the usual suspects of lawyers and accountants and surveyors. Is if a local authority wants to challenge something, the last thing you do is phone up Savills or one of the big legal firms. You talk to radical lawyers, radical valuers, God help us, even people like ourselves in universities who actually think differently about how land is valued and how these things are judged, and build up a case with a different set of premises about, you know, what value is, what amenity is, what viability is, and so on. So you just approach it from an entirely different direction, because once you just put your case in the hands of the standard set of lawyers and accountants and consultants, you've had it, because they're a club. They operate with the same set of assumptions, and you've got to step outside those assumptions and try and challenge it quite independently. I think it's possible. Obviously, it's risky, but the whole point is to take risks, really, to kind of push back on this. Because if you don't take risk, you're basically, you know, you're basically working with the system. If you don't take risks, you're not going to be able to meet the needs of your constituents, you know, or the people in your area. You've got to say, look, we're fighting for you, and this is how we're doing it.
Thanks, Bob. That's great. There's lots of new questions coming in, and we're running out of time. I think we're due to run till 20 past, Claire. So I've got another 2 minutes. I'm going to try and roll a couple of questions together for you, Bob. One, which was my favourite question, was just how do we take back land, which I think is a nice direct question. But linked to that, there's a couple of questions around that I spotted around kind of overcoming the sense that there's a growth model here, and the economic development is dependent on continuing to feed this property machine. And another question which Ben popped in the chat, which related to whether it would help to decommoditize housing by kind of talking about housing as a human right rather than housing as a commodity. So maybe those are 3 quite nice kind of linked questions maybe to end with, if that's all right, Bob.
Yeah, the decommodification, just that last point about human rights, I think that is a basis for one of those legal challenges, actually. You know, if it can be established as a human right, understanding Wales are trying to establish housing as a human right, well, if that can be put in law, then you can use that in these cases we're talking about. How to get land? Well, compulsory purchase is one way of doing it. Buying land in the market. I mean, there's lots of ways in which you can, if you use planning really effectively and strongly, you can keep land value down. But to acquire land, you've got to buy it through CPO or other means, and this could mean, you know, making CPO easier, making it cheaper, which means reforming the 1961 Land Compensation Act. Sorry about that bit of jargon, but there are problems with CPOs at the moment. And then, yes, the growth model. I mean, this is all about growth. I mean, you know, government is obsessed with this idea that, you know, all governments are obsessed with the idea, you know, of growth. And this government in particular, the Johnson government anyway, is very much focused on the fact that housing is a lead, a lead factor in growth because of its impact on the economy as a whole, and because it's seen as increasing consumer expenditure and consolidating their votes. So yeah, it's the growth and the house building market are one and the same thing.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Bob. Apologies, because there's people whose questions and comments we didn't manage to get around to. There's going to be a bit of a chance for everyone to feed in and share their opinions in some breakout groups in a few minutes. So hopefully you'll be able to save up those comments and take them in there. I'm just about not blinded anymore. The sun's come out in Sheffield, which is incredibly unusual. So it's in my face. But I'm going to hand back to Claire now and just end by saying thanks very much, Bob, for all your thoughtful responses to those questions.
All right, thanks, Andy.
Thanks both of you for that. That was a great session. And what we might try and do, if possible, is between us to try and answer some of your questions in a written format, which we might be able to send back when we respond to, when we send a follow-up email. So we'll try our best to answer some of those questions, if that's possible. I've just dumped you in that, Bob.
That's fine.
Okay. I'm going to hand over to Kelly now, who's going to explain what we're doing in the breakout rooms, and then you will all go to your breakout rooms, and then we will reconvene.
I had an amazingly enthusiastic and well-informed group, very passionate, and many of them were really keen to be in the core group, so this is great. Incredibly frustrated that working within the system gets you nowhere, which means many of them have just exhausted the working within the system and are thinking, what else can we do? How can we work differently? So the new approaches that we discussed were the connecting it with the social justice, with the green, the sustainability issues. The need to work at all levels of local authorities and MSPs and MPs for lobbying and influencing, and to start taking risks and becoming more visible with protest and action, and getting as many people on board as we could. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much, Jean, and to that group. And Helen, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, we had, again, a very interesting discussion. We had councillors and community councillors, and everything that Bob had said was very familiar to for them, their own experience, sadly. One thing I will mention is that there's a local governance review happening in the course of this Parliament, which will have a consultation called Democracy Matters, and that, because one of the problems obviously is democracy as much as the housing developers, and there is a suggestion that the government is really serious about bringing real power to a new structure below the councils that we have, the 32 councils that we have, and not just beefing up community councils as they are. So that's certainly something to look out for in the next year or two. I'm sure Planning Democracy will keep you well informed about that one. And just as a plea, community councils are doing their best, but they are absolutely crying out for help in dealing with this onslaught, as I'm sure you're all well aware. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Helen, and thanks to your group too. Ben, can I come to you next, please? And then Andy after Ben.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, similar to the other groups, similarly, my group was also very well informed, and in fact so well informed that we had Bob Colenutt in my group, so I really hit the jackpot there. Although I treated him very poorly and gave him very little opportunity to speak, so sorry about that, Bob. A couple of reflections came out of it that might be of interest about the kind of asymmetric nature of the dispute between communities and the property lobby, and a reflection about the difficulty of making successful national campaigns about this topic, and that it might be easier to focus on local campaigns rather than national ones. And one idea that came out a couple of times was about the possibilities presented by the forthcoming SNP and Greens deal. There might be an opportunity to influence the Scottish Green Party in particular in relation to this campaign. So that's it for me.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks to your group too. Andy, You're up, and then Sue, you'll be next after Andy.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to, like everyone else, had a really great group with lots of kind of energy and enthusiasm to be involved, who all saw this as a really important issue to be involved in trying to do something about, a sense of frustration about kind of where to begin maybe, and a sense that we need to make the kind of the alternatives more visible and make them feel more possible. Part of that is just that, you know, people are fighting uphill struggles often locally against a system which is set up not to recognise their concerns and not to yield to what they want. That there are alternatives though, and those alternatives offer the prospect of kind of making the right land available instead of just the profitable land, most profitable land, increasing the amounts of community-led development, but also possibilities for self-build that could really improve the quality of housing. In response to the concerns that everybody felt about all those things. Sort of a couple of main suggestions for ways of beginning to do that. Similarly to Ben's group, the Green Party was mentioned as a possible line of political influence and trying to kind of lobby and try to see what might be done there. And with a view to changing the rules to enable all of those alternatives, to make them more possible, but at the same time also trying to take advantage of existing possibilities for getting hold of community land, community assets, showing that this stuff can be done, trying to show that those alternatives are possible, and trying to kind of raise awareness of the possibility that we could develop and use land and build housing differently. And I'll stop now. Thanks.
Super. Thank you very much, Andy, and thanks to your group too. Sue, over to you.
Ooh, right, another little enthusiastic group we had, including Tom on his bike, but he disappeared most of the time, but he did appear for a bit. Yeah, we heard about Gladman, and it was pointed out how Gladman's, what they do every day is what we and local authorities encounter, well, far less often. So they are so practiced, and that it does require some high level action, which seems far away from where we are at the moment. But the communities are all facing the same sort of problems, and the fact that planning democracy is pulling them together and trying to have an empowering working together is very important, and planning democracy's role was praised, and everyone thought it was an absolutely brilliant presentation and was well presented briefly with all the complications, so thanks Bob for that. Just another thing to mention, the need for housing, not just new build housing, but brownfield sites, of which we have umpteen, and improving the housing stock that exists already, all in anticipation of COP26 and getting things right for the climate. So that's about us. Thank you.
Super, thanks Sue. And I think that just leaves me and my group, but please do shout if I haven't come to your facilitators. So yeah, the group said it was a really good and helpful presentation from Bob. There were comments around it. It seems that we're not building for communities, but rather for consumers or those with certain aspirations. There was a little bit of discussion around things like the role of banks, the rates of lending, holiday lets, ownership, absent tenancies, value accumulation. But ultimately, it seems like there is a bit of a mountain to climb in this campaign, but really fundamentally there's a need to change political attitude, which sometimes can feel like a bit of an insurmountable problem, but I'm sure through this campaign it will not be. So you know, there were comments that there could be a focus on local government, but that also seems really entrenched. So actually, to effect change, maybe there needs to be an attitude change focus at the national government level, which it seems is a bit different to some discussion other groups have had. So to me that maybe suggests a bit of a multi-pronged approach to the campaign. But it does need to be a political response, the group said. So, you know, communication with parties seems really important to that, you know, looking at the focus on the policy level. But there is a general feeling there is a lack of willingness to take a look at the housing crisis and the land supply. There was also a bit of discussion about the kind of priority focus on economic development in some of these conversations, and the need to do a bit of culture change and overturning of the mindset of that focus. So is that something maybe we can bring into the campaign. Should we switch to perhaps public ownership to burst competition and the property lobby? What are some of the different conversations and opportunities there to see things as perhaps being owned by communities as a whole? Again, that tied into that need to change attitudes, to maybe give people inspiration for other ideas and ways of doing things. There was for a moment a bit of a focus on social or affordable housing. So it seems that developers are able to, at the moment, wriggle out of giving some provision for social or affordable housing. So is there something that needs to be focused on there? So maybe a need to work on the requirement for developers to do the building of that housing. And there was also a comment as well that was seen quite important about the lack or no appreciation of the impact on communities. There seems to be a bit of a weakened and demoralised local planning system. Some people in the group hadn't really thought that was the case until they listened to the talk, so that was quite interesting to note. But that certainly pointed to some issues with process and community power or lack thereof in decision making. So again, is there something that could be focused on there? But yeah, really great talk, Bob. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I just wondered whether Bob wanted to come back with a kind of final comment at all.
I just want to thank you all for coming and for your amazing comments and enthusiasms. And it just shows there is an appetite out there to do something, because so many people feel disempowered, fed up, manipulated. That there is a kind of anger there, a current of anger, which I think can be converted into some politics as we're talking about. And it's just the politicians need to feel this. And I think that's our job.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thanks, Bob. And I think that there are lots of opportunities. Perhaps the situation isn't as quite so dire in Scotland as it is down in England. I think we have potential land reforms. We've got the local governance review. We've got the national planning framework coming up. And we've also got a new factor, which is the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland. And there's potential there with human rights, as Shiv was saying in the chat as well. The human right to a house, to affordable, adequate housing. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, and we need to grasp those. So we will be having another event, a follow-up event. I shall send you details of that probably in early July. I'm thinking maybe the 5th of July, Monday the 5th of July. So maybe just mark that out in your diaries, and we will send out a Google Doc to see if how you want to help us campaign. What also helps us to campaign is donations. As I said, we're largely voluntary. We run on a shoestring. We really need your donations to keep us going. So please do consider making a regular donation to us. So thank you everybody for coming along, and without further ado, I think I shall bid you all good night.